1951, three of the most respected archaeologists in America published a book about a stretch of Mississippi farmland. In it, they admitted something that should have made national news and instead sat quietly in a Harvard Museum volume for the next 70 years. They wrote that in the Lower Mississippi Alluvial Valley, the archaeological record does not sit on the ground. It sits under it, under 10 feet of it, and the only thing that decides whether you ever see it is the river. The book is called Archaeological Survey in the Lower Mississippi Alluvial Valley, 1940 to 1947. The authors were Philip Phillips of Harvard's Peabody Museum, James A. Ford of the American Museum of Natural History, and James B. Griffin of the University of Michigan. 3 institutions, 7 years of fieldwork interrupted by a world war, 325 pages. They had set out to survey the northern 2/3 of the alluvial valley of the Lower Mississippi, roughly from the mouth of the Ohio River down to Vicksburg. 350 miles of the flattest, richest, most heavily farmed land in the United States. What they were looking for was the record of who lived there before. What they found was that most of the record was gone. Not destroyed, buried. The Mississippi River does not simply flow through the delta, it builds the delta. Every flood it lays down another sheet of silt across the floodplain, and every sheet is another layer of ground over whatever was standing there before. Houses, fire pits, post holes, burials, whole villages, whole earthworks. The river writes over its own page and starts again. And this is the part that makes the delta different from every other archaeological landscape in North America. In the desert southwest, the past sits on the surface, bleached and obvious. In the delta, the past is a subscription service. The river charges you a drought or a flood or a levee break to see it, and then it takes it back. The Choctaw had a word for that. They had more than a word. They had a body of tradition recorded by federal ethnographers over a century ago about what happens beneath water in this country and what lives there and what happens to the people who go down and do not come back up. That tradition is the reason this video exists, not because it explains the mounds, because of what it says about the relationship between the people who lived here and a river that periodically erases everything. Here is the fact that got me into this. There is a National Historic Landmark in Humphreys County, Mississippi, 4 miles north of the town of Belzoni. It is called Jaketown. 18 mounds were originally recorded there. 3 are visible today. The other 15 are not lost, and they were not all destroyed. Archaeologists believe portions of as many as 13 of them are still there, sitting intact under about 10 feet of flood deposits in a field right now, while you watch this. Jaketown is one of the oldest earthwork sites in the entire Lower Mississippi Valley. The earliest construction there, including the first stages of the mound archaeologists label Mound A and at least 2 others, dates to the late Archaic Poverty Point period, roughly 1500 to 1350 BC. To calibrate that, this is earlier than the Olmec colossal heads, contemporary with the late Bronze Age in the eastern Mediterranean. People in west central Mississippi were organizing enough labor to raise earthen architecture at a time when most of the world's populations were not building anything that would survive. They were also part of a continental trade network. Jaketown produced imported stone from far outside the region. The site sat within the Poverty Point cultural sphere. More than 100 documented sites strung along both sides of the Mississippi River, moving raw material across an enormous distance without wheels, without draft animals, without writing. And Jaketown's dates run early. Some archaeologists have suggested that Jaketown may have provided the template that Poverty Point itself was later built from. Then the river came. Published research on Jaketown puts it plainly. Between roughly 3,445 and 3,270 years before present, the community there built at least 2 earthworks and multiple post structures. And then, sometime after 3,300 years before present, catastrophic flooding buried the entire late archaic landscape under alluvium. Not a bad season, not a hard year. The entire lived surface of a functioning society sealed under river mud. And here is the detail that I keep turning over. They came back. After the flooding, mound building at Jaketown resumed in the early woodland period, around 500 BC. Later people arrived, found the mounds of the people who had been drowned out 1,000 years earlier, built on top of them, and added their own. Mounds B and C at Jaketown are Mississippian period constructions, roughly AD 1200 to 1600. That is a site with about 3,000 years of continuous human decision-making stacked into it, interrupted by one flood so total, it required a fresh start. So when we talk about what is under the delta, we are not speaking figuratively. There is a measurable, surveyed, radiocarbon-dated depth of human occupation sitting beneath the plow zone of Mississippi farmland. And the reason it is down there rather than up here is water. Now, the Choctaw. There is a hard distinction that has to be made before going further, and it will be maintained through the rest of this video. The mound building societies of the Delta and the historic Choctaw Nation are not simply the same people. The archaeological consensus is more complicated than that, and the Choctaw themselves preserve more than one account of their own origin. Nenia Waya, the Mother Mound, sits in Winston County in east-central Mississippi. It measures roughly 218 feet by 140 feet and stands about 25 feet high. Archaeological evidence indicates the mound was first built in the Middle Woodland period, approximately AD 0 to 300, and remained occupied until around AD 700. Historical data suggests that the Choctaw, as a distinct people, moved into the Mississippi area considerably later, in the late 1500s or early 1600s. That gap is real, and archaeologists have not resolved it. The mound was abandoned centuries before there is clear evidence of Choctaw presence in the region, and documented veneration of the site by the Choctaw appears in the historical record from the 18th century onward. Choctaw tradition itself contains both possibilities. One account describes emergence. The southeastern nations came up out of the Mother Mound, the creek first, drying themselves on its slope before moving east. Then the others, with the Choctaw emerging last and choosing to stay. Another account describes migration. Choctaw ancestors came from the west, carrying a sacred pole, planting it in the ground each night to be read in the morning. Wherever it leaned, they moved on. At Naniwaya, the pole stood straight. Both stories are Choctaw. Neither is a footnote to the other. And in the version recorded by ethnographers, they are stories about a specific relationship to ground that opens and closes. In January and February of 1910, an anthropologist named David Fumsug Bushnell Jr. sat with a Choctaw woman named Pisatuntema at Bayou Lacombe in St. Tammany Parish, Louisiana, a few miles north of Lake Pontchartrain. She was about 50 years old, the daughter of a man recognized as a chief. She had learned the old tribal myths from her father. Bushnell wrote them down and published them. The community he was recording was small. He counted 10 or 12 Choctaw living there and described them as the last of what had once been a much larger branch of the tribe in that section. The first thing Pisatuntema told him was about a hill. The account runs like this. In very ancient times, before people lived on the earth, a hill was formed, and from its topmost point a passage led down deep into the interior of the earth. Later, when there were animals and trees and lakes and rivers had been made, the Choctaw came up through that passageway. From there they scattered in every direction, but they always remembered the hill from whose summit they first saw the sun. A second version adds a detail. Men and grasshoppers came up together through a long passageway that led from a great cavern inside the earth. They had been made down there, out of yellow clay, and they kept coming up and scattering until the passage was closed. There were still men left inside when it closed. Those men were changed into ants, which is why ants come up out of holes in the ground. The structure of that story is the same structure the delta has. There is a surface, there is a great deal underneath it, there is a passage between the two, and it does not stay open. I want to be very clear about what I am and am not saying. I am not claiming this is a coded memory of a buried archaeological site. Emergence traditions appear across many indigenous nations in North America, and they are religious accounts, not survey reports. What I am pointing at is narrower and I think stranger. This is a body of tradition held by people living in the alluvial South that is organized around underground space, water, and the idea that what is beneath the ground is not empty. Bushnell also recorded a flood. The Choctaw name he gives it is Okwa Falama, the returning water. In the story, Abba, the spirit above, appears and tells the Choctaw to build a large boat and to place in it the birds and the beasts of their country and to gather food. He shows them where to build it, and the place he chooses is high and dry and far from any water. Most of the people lose confidence at that point and go their ways. One family stays and builds. Strangers pass while it is under construction and ask why anyone would build a large boat out there, far from any water. The builders answer that they are following Abba's command and that they do not know why they were commanded. Then the rain comes and the wind takes the tallest pines, and everyone else tries to build boats and rafts too late and is swept away. The water rises until it covers the high land where the boat was built. It rises until it reaches the sky. On the fifth morning, the wind drops and the sun comes out, and there is no land in any direction, only water with trees and dead animals floating on it. A crow and a dove are sent out. East, south, west, nothing. The crow goes north and comes back carrying a magnolia leaf. Bushnell, to his credit, flagged the problem immediately. He wrote in his own commentary that the flood account shows strong evidence of having been influenced by early missionary teaching, and noted that Pisatuntema's own instructor had been a Catholic priest, Père Adrien Rouquet, who had died about 20 years before. So this is a story that has been through a filter, and the ethnographer who collected it said so in print. But Bushnell also pushed back on his own century. He noted that Brinton, a prominent scholar of the day, had left the Choctaw off his list of American tribes with a well-authenticated flood legend, and Bushnell said flatly that the evidence indicates they did possess one. And the detail that survives, regardless of missionary influence, is the name. Okwa Falama, the returning water. Not the flood, not the deluge, the water that comes back. That is a Delta phrase. That is precisely the behavior of the Lower Mississippi. The water is not an event. It is a visitor with a schedule. If you have been watching for a while, you know I do not do supernatural payoffs on this channel. There isn't one coming. What there is instead is a set of real records that, laid next to each other, are harder to sit with than any monster would be. If that is the kind of thing you are here for, Subscribing genuinely helps this channel keep getting made. Bushnell recorded something else at Bayou Lacombe, and this is where the tradition gets specific about water in a way that is difficult to shake. Among the beings described in the Choctaw material collected by Bushnell and by Henry S. Halbert in the 19th century are the Okwa Naholo. The name is usually translated as white people of the water. They live in deep pools in rivers and bayous. Their skin is pale, and the comparison the sources use over and over is the skin of a trout. There is said to be such a pool in the Abita River. The account describes it as clear and cold, and easy to see far down into, while the surrounding river water is dark and muddy. Every Choctaw in that area was said to know where it was. When Choctaw swam near that pool, the Okwa Naholo would try to seize them and draw them down into the depths, to their homes. A person taken down does not simply drown. The account is more particular than that. After the third day, their skin begins to change and comes to resemble the skin of a trout. They learn to live and eat and swim as fish do, and they are not entirely gone. When the friends of a person who has become one of the Okwa Naholo gather on the riverbank near the pool and sing, he will often rise to the surface and speak with them. Bushnell also recorded a first-hand account. A woman living at Bayou Lacombe named Halima, she also went by Louisa, described an experience from when she was a child, roughly 40 years before he spoke to her. She was 7 or 8, swimming in the Abita with a group of Choctaw children, and had gone a short distance from the others. She said she felt the Okwa Naholo drawing her down. The water seemed to rise around her. She was struggling to free herself when other children understood what was happening, reached her, took her by the hair, and pulled her to shore. Bushnell noted that she related it with the greatest sincerity. He also noted the aftermath, which is the part that reads as most human. The children never swam near that pool again. That is folklore. I am fencing it as folklore, and it stays fenced. But sit with the shape of it for a second. A pool in a muddy river that is inexplicably clear and cold and deep. Everyone local knows exactly where it is. Nobody swims there. And there is a specific, transmissible, socially enforced rule about it that a child in the 1870s carried into adulthood and reported to a federal ethnographer in 1910. There is a version of that story that is entirely mundane and entirely true. Rivers have cold water intrusions. They have undercut banks, spring-fed holes, deep scour pools with recirculating currents that will hold a swimmer under. A clear, cold pool in a dark, warm river is exactly what a spring or a deep hole looks like. A culture that swims in rivers for a living learns which specific places kill people, and it encodes that knowledge in a form children remember. The story is not the danger, the story is the safety protocol, which brings us back to the ground. In 1820, at a tavern on the Natchez Trace called Doak's Stand, the Choctaw signed a treaty. Andrew Jackson and Thomas Hines negotiated for the United States. Pushmataha, Mashulatabi, and Apakshanabi represented the 3 major Choctaw districts. The convention had opened on October 10th. Jackson proposed a swap. Choctaw land in Mississippi for territory west of the river. Pushmataha, who had actually been out there, told him to his face that he was misrepresenting the quality of the western land. He said he knew the country. He said the grass was short. He said beaver, honey, and fruit were scarce. Jackson's answer was not an argument. Records of the convention have him telling the Choctaw that many of their nation were already beyond the Mississippi, that others were leaving every year, and that if they refused, the nation would be destroyed. On October 18th, 1820, the chief signed. The treaty transferred 5,169,788 acres. The Choctaw Nation's own history describes what was traded away as extremely valuable delta land and describes the methods used to obtain the signatures as including intimidation and bribery. What they received in exchange was roughly 13 million acres between the Arkansas and Red Rivers in what is now southeastern Oklahoma, land that was, as the Choctaw pointed out at the time, useless to them unless they agreed to leave. Doak's Stand is where removal stopped being implied and started being discussed openly. In 1830, at Dancing Rabbit Creek, the rest went, so the delta became cotton country, and cotton country needs flat ground. Here is what that meant for what was standing on the surface. At Winterville, outside Greenville in Washington County, there is a mound complex built by the Plaquemine Mississippian culture. Occupation begins around AD 1000 in the Coles Creek period. The mounds go up between roughly AD 1200 and 1450. Mound A stands about 55 feet high. It is among the 10 tallest earthen structures in the United States, and the tallest between Natchez and Cahokia. The site originally had at least 23 mounds. 12 survive. The rest were leveled by highway construction and by farming. According to the site's own documentation, the most recent mound removal there happened in the 1990s. The archaeology at Winterville is genuinely strange on its own terms. Excavation in Mound B revealed a series of burned structures stacked directly one on top of the next, buildings razed, burned, and rebuilt on the same spot. A ritual pattern documented elsewhere in the Mississippian world. Sometime in the late 14th century, a great fire consumed the building on top of the temple mound, and the cause of that fire is not known. Occupation continued afterward, but no more mounds were built or maintained. Population shifted to sites about 50 miles south in the lower Yazoo Basin. By around AD 1450, the site appears to have been abandoned entirely. And then, centuries later, an archaeologist working the site found charcoal dates indicating a large feast on one of the mounds roughly 100 years after everyone had assumed the place was empty. Somebody came back. Once, to eat. Nobody knows who or why, or whether they stayed. That pattern, abandonment, silence, return, repeats across this landscape, and every time it does, the material evidence for it is thin, because the Delta is the single worst place in North America to try to keep a record. At Naniwaya, small burial mounds near the Mother Mound have been nearly leveled by plowing. A raised embankment and a moat once ringed the site. Most of that earthen enclosure is gone to cultivation, with a short segment surviving near a swamp to the northwest. At Jaketown, the smaller mounds were destroyed by plowing and highway construction. At Ingomar, in the hills to the northeast, a 14-mound complex spread across 70 acres. Most of it was gone by the late 1800s, looted or plowed flat. None of this is a conspiracy. It is a machine. Flat, fertile alluvium is the most agriculturally valuable land in the country, and a mound is an obstacle to a plow. Every year, the equipment got better at removing obstacles. But there is a second machine running underneath the first one, and it does not remove anything. It hides things, and every so often it shows you what it has. Consider a single date, April 21st, 1927. That morning, an Army district engineer sent a wire to the head of the Army Corps of Engineers. The message, as recorded, said that the levee had broken at a ferry landing at Mounds, Mississippi at 8 a.m., and that the crevasse would overflow the entire Mississippi Delta. Understand the name. The break happened at Mounds Landing in Lower Bolivar County. It is called that because of what is there. Hundreds of men had worked through the night stacking sandbags. Many of them were black laborers working under armed guard, with guards threatening to shoot anyone who tried to leave. When the levee went, the river came through with a force that has been compared to Niagara Falls, and it took workers, trees, buildings, and railroad embankments with it. The crevasse at Mounds Landing was the largest ever to open on the Mississippi River. It remains recorded as the worst levee break anywhere in the United States. Estimates of its size run to roughly 100 feet deep and half a mile wide. Within 10 days, it had put 10 feet of water over nearly 1 million acres. In its full reach, it flooded an area on the order of 50 miles wide and 100 miles long. Even Egypt Ridge, which was named for the fact that no flood had ever reached it, went under. 75 miles from the break, in Yazoo City, water covered the roofs of houses. The river ran through that crevasse for months. Across the whole 1927 event, the lower delta became an inland sea of more than 10 million acres. Roughly 27,000 square miles went under at peak, to depths reaching 30 feet, in places 80 miles wide. Estimates of the dead range from about 246 to 500. Hundreds of thousands of people were displaced. The human consequence of that flood reshaped the country. Displaced Delta workers joined the Great Migration north, carrying the Delta blues with them, which is a line you can draw more or less directly to American popular music. The disaster produced the Flood Control Act of 1928 and the modern federal levee system. And the geological consequence is the part relevant here. That much water, moving at that speed, scours in some places and deposits in others. It cuts the ground open where it comes through hardest, and it lays down fresh sediment where it slows. Every major flood in the Delta's history has been simultaneously an act of destruction and an act of burial, and the two happen in different fields on the same day, which is the mechanism behind the entire tradition. Sometimes the river takes the covers off, sometimes it puts more on, and that gives you the other half of the cycle, the one people actually go out and walk on, because the river reveals things when it goes down too. In the fall of 2022, the Mississippi River dropped to near record lows. Around 58% of the state of Mississippi was in moderate drought. Plaquemines Parish in Louisiana declared a state of emergency over saltwater intrusion pushing up the channel because there was no longer enough river pressure to hold the Gulf back. And people started walking out onto the riverbed. At Tower Rock in Perry County, Missouri, a formation normally reachable only by boat, the water dropped below 1.5 feet, and visitors simply walked out to it across the exposed bed. In downtown Baton Rouge, a resident named Patrick Ford was out on one of his regular scavengers along the riverfront when he found the exposed remains of a ship. He described the moment to a local station as immediately texting friends that he thought he had found a sunken ship. Louisiana State archaeologist Chip McGimsey identified it as the Brook Hill, built in 1896 in Indiana. It went down on September 29, 1915, in a storm that also sank its sister vessel, the Istruma. About 95 feet long, with roughly a third of it visible on the shoreline that October. And here is the piece that matters for the pattern. The Brook Hill had come up before. In 1992, low water exposed parts of it, and an archaeological firm did some work on it. McGimsey described the earlier exposure. The vessel was full of mud with mud all around it, only the very tops of the sides showing, and archaeologists had to move a great deal of dirt just to get narrow windows in to see pieces of it. 1992, 2022, 30 years between viewings. The river showed it, took it back, and showed it again a generation later. McGimsey said at the time that he expected more discoveries as the water kept falling, and that he had already received calls about 2 more possible wrecks. Elsewhere along the same river, in the same season, a sunken casino boat, the Diamond Lady, taken out of service in 1999 and sunk by a storm in 2021, came out of the water at Memphis. A 6th grader walking his dog on an exposed sandbar south of Baton Rouge found a previously unrecorded shipwreck. It was named after him. And on October 22, 2022, a woman rock hunting with her family in Mississippi found skeletal remains on the exposed bed, including what appeared to be a human jawbone and rib, and reported them to state authorities. That is 1 drought season, on 1 river, in 1 autumn. Now put those 2 facts next to each other, because this is the whole video in one move. Fact 1. The Delta's archaeological record is buried under alluvium, in some cases about 10 feet of it, and portions of as many as 13 mounds at a single National Historic Landmark are sitting down there right now. Fact 2. The river exposes and reburies its contents on a cycle measured in decades, and the last 2 exposures of a single documented wreck were 30 years apart. Nobody has to invent anything to make that unsettling. The Delta is a landscape that holds its own history hostage and releases it on a schedule nobody controls. There is one more thing worth saying about how much is still down there, because it is easy to assume this is all settled science that was wrapped up in the 1950s. It is not. Archaeologists working the Delta today describe sites that were assumed to be destroyed, where geophysical survey shows there are actually still a few feet of intact deposit left below the leveled surface. Because people frequently lived on a ground surface for centuries before any mound went up on it, the layers underneath a flattened mound often survive the flattening. The visible monument is gone. The village is not. And the chronology itself keeps moving. Work by the geologist Roger Saucier tied Delta landforms to Dalton-era projectile points, made roughly 9,900 to 10,000 years ago, at campsites on the Arkansas side of the valley, pushing the age of those landforms back from an assumed 5,000 years or so. Recent LiDAR mapping in Mississippi supported that. People were living in this valley at least 10,000 years ago, hunting animals of the Pleistocene in what is now cotton ground. 10,000 years of occupation, on a floodplain that resurfaces itself. The math on that is not comfortable. Whatever is under the Delta is not a site, it is a stack. And I think that is the honest answer to the question in the title, which is not the answer people usually want. What did the Choctaw say was under the Delta? The recorded tradition, taken at its word and fenced as tradition, says 3 things. It says the ground is not solid, it has a passage in it, and that passage was open once and is closed now, and there are still things on the other side of it that used to be people. It says the water comes back. Okwa Falama. Not a single catastrophe but a returning and a warning attached to it, that everything on the surface is provisional, and the only reasonable response to being told to build a boat on dry ground is to build the boat. And it says that deep water holds people who were once like you, that they are still there, that they can hear you from the bank, and that if you sing, they will come up and talk to you. None of that is a claim about archaeology. All of it is a claim about a place, and the documented record of that place, the Peabody Survey, the buried mounds at Jaketown, the levee break at Mounds Landing, the 1992 and 2022 exposures of a ship in Baton Rouge, the leveled mounds at Winterville, the feast on an abandoned mound a century after the abandonment, describes a landscape that behaves exactly the way that tradition says it behaves. The river covers, the river uncovers. It does not do either on a human schedule, and it does not ask. The Choctaw, who were removed from this land in 1820 and 1830, did not get to keep it. The Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians is still in Mississippi, still holds Naniwaya, and celebrates its repossession of the Mother Mound every year on the second Thursday of August. The site has a gate on it now because it has been vandalized, and its exact location is not published. That is not a legend. That is a living nation guarding a real hill. The thing I cannot stop thinking about is Jaketown. 13 mounds, 10 feet down, in a field you could drive past without noticing, 4 miles north of Belzoni, on Highway 7. They are not lost. Somebody wrote down where they are. We simply cannot see them because the river decided we shouldn't, about 3,300 years ago, and it has not changed its mind. If it ever does, if some drought or some crevasse or some future flood takes that 10 feet off, somebody is going to walk out into that field and stand on a surface that no human being has stood on since the Bronze Age. The delta shows you what it has once a generation, and it never shows you the same thing twice. If you know a delta site that came up in a drought or a flood, or a story your family tells about what the water uncovered, put it in the comments. Those are consistently the best thing that happens under these videos. Sources are in the description. The Peabody Survey, the Bushnell Ethnography, the Mississippi Department of Archives and History Mound Records, and the 1927 flood documentation are all public and all worth your time. For more interesting videos like this, consider checking this out.